He sat wrapped in one of the gray rescue blankets from the emergency bag and drank hot tea. The dark sea lapped about. The Coast Guard boat that had pulled up 100 yards off sat rocking in the swells with the running lights on, and beyond that, 10 miles to the north, you could see the lights of trucks moving along the causeway, coming out of New Orleans and heading east along US 90 toward Pass Christian, Biloxi, Mobile. Mozart's second violin concerto was playing on the tape deck. The air temperature was 44 degrees, and it was 3:17 in the morning. The tender was lying on his elbows with the headset on, watching the dark water beneath them. From time to time, the sea would flare with a soft, sulfurous light where 44 feet down, Euler was working with the cutting torch. Western watched the tender, then he blew on the tea and sipped it, and he watched the lights moving along the causeway like the slow cellular crawl of water drops on a wire, strobing faintly where they passed behind the concrete balusters. There was an onshore wind coming up past the western tip of Cat Island, and there was a light chop to the water, smell of oil, and the rich tidal funk of mangrove and saltgrass from the islands. The tender sat up and took off the headset and began to rifle through the toolbox. "How's he doing?" "Doing okay." "What's he want?" "The big side cutters." He hooked a set of shears to a carabiner and snapped the carabiner over the work line and watched the shears slide into the sea. He looked at Western. "How deep can you use acetylene?" 30, 35 feet. "And after that, it's Sox Yark." "Yeah." The tender nodded and pulled the headset back on. Western drained the last of the tea and shook out the dregs and put the cup back in his bag and reached and got his flippers and pulled them on. He slipped the blanket from his shoulders and stood and zipped up the jacket of his wetsuit and bent and got his tanks and lifted them by the straps and pulled them on. He fastened the straps and pulled on his mask. The tender slid the headset back. "You care if I change stations?" Western lifted the mask up. "It's a tape." "You care if I change tapes?" "No." The tender shook his head. "Helicopter us out here in the freezing ass cold at 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't know what the hurry was." "Meaning that they're all dead?" "Yeah." "You know this how?" "Just stands to reason." Western looked out at the Coast Guard boat, the shape of the lights, unchained in the chop of the dark water. He looked at the tender. "Reason," he said. "Right." He pulled on his gloves. The white beam of the spotlight raced over the water and back again and then went dark. He pulled on his belt and hooked it and fitted the regulator into his mouth, pulled down the mask, and stepped into the water. Dropping slowly through the dark toward the intermittent flare of the torch below, he reached the stabilizer and dropped down onto the fuselage and turned and swam slowly along, tracing the smooth aluminum under his gloved hand, the bead of the rivets. The torch flared again, the shape of the fuselage tunneling off into the dark. He kicked past the hulking nacelles that held the turbofan engines and dropped down the side of the fuselage and into the pool of light. Euler had cut away the latching mechanism and the door stood open. He was just inside the plane, crouched against the bulkhead. He gestured with his head, and Western pulled up in the door, and Euler shone his light down the aircraft aisle. The people sitting in their seats, their hair floating, their mouths open, their eyes devoid of speculation. The work basket was sitting on the floor inside the door, and Western reached and got the other dive light and pulled himself into the plane. He kicked his way slowly down the aisle above the seats, his tanks dragging overhead, the faces of the dead inches away. Everything that could float was against the ceiling: pencils, cushions, styrofoam coffee cups, sheets of paper with the ink, draining off into hieroglyphic smears, tightening claustrophobia. He doubled under and got himself turned around and made his way back. Euler was swimming down the outside of the fuselage with his light. The light made a corolla in the airspace of the double glass. Western went forward and pushed his way into the cockpit. The co-pilot was still strapped into his seat, but the pilot was hovering overhead against the ceiling with his arms and legs hanging down like an enormous marionette. Western shone his light over the instruments. Twin throttle levers in the console were pulled all the way into the off position. The gauges were analog, and when the circuits shorted out in the seawater, they'd return to neutral settings. There was a square space in the panel where one of the avionics boards had been removed. It had been held in place by 6 screws by the holes there, and there were 3 jack plugs hanging down where the pigtails had been disconnected. Western wedged his knees against the backs of the seats at either side. Good stainless steel Hoyer watch on the co-pilot's wrist. He studied the panels. What's missing? Colesman altimeters and vertical speed indicators, fuel in pounds, airspeed at 0, Collins avionics. Otherwise, it was the navigation rack. He backed out of the cockpit. The bubbles from the regulator sorted themselves along the dome of the roof overhead. He'd looked in every possible space for the pilot's flight bag, and he was pretty sure it wasn't there. He pushed out through the door and looked for Euler. He was hovering over the wing. He made a circling motion with one hand and pointed upward and kicked off toward the surface. They sat on the small deck of the inflatable and pulled off their masks and spat out the regulator mouthpieces and leaned back into the tanks and loosened them. Creedence Clearwater was playing on the tape deck. Western got his thermos out. "Time is it?" said Euler. 4:12. He spat and wiped his nose with the back of his wrist. He leaned past Western and twisted shut the valves on the gas bottles. "I hate shit like this," he said. "What, bodies?" "Yeah, well, that too, but no. Shit that makes no sense, that you can't make sense out of." "Yeah. There won't be anybody out here for another couple of hours or 3. What do you want to do?" "What do I want to do, or what do I think we should do?" "I don't know. What do you make of this?" "I don't." Euler stripped off his gloves and unzipped his dive bag and got his thermos out. He took the plastic cup off the bottle and unscrewed the cap and poured the cup and blew on it. The tender was pulling up the work line in the basket. "Can't even see the damn plane. And some fisherman's supposed to have found it? That's bullshit." "You don't think the lights could have stayed on for a while?" "No." "Probably right." Euler dried his hands on a towel from his bag and got his cigarettes and lighter out and shucked a cigarette from the pack and lit it. Sat looking out over the black and lapping water. They're all just sitting in their seats? What the fuck is that? I'd say they'd had to be already dead when the plane sank. Euler smoked and shook his head. "Yeah, and no fuel slick. There's a panel missing from the instrumentation, and the pilot's flight bag is missing." "Yeah? You know what this is, don't you?" "No, do you?" "Aliens." "Fuck you, Western." Western smiled. "What do you think the range is on one of those things? The Jetstar?" "Yeah, probably a couple of thousand miles. Why?" "Because you got to wonder where it was coming from." "Yeah, what else?" "I think they've been down there a few days." "Fuck. They don't look all that well kept. How long does it take for bodies to come up?" "I don't know, 2 or 3 days. Depends on the temperature of the water." "How many are there?" 7, plus the pilot and co-pilot, 9 in all." "What do you want to do? Go home and go to bed?" Euler blew at his cup and sipped his coffee. "Yeah," he said. The tender's name was Campbell. He studied Western, and he looked at Euler. "There's got to be some ugly shit down there," he said. "That don't bother you?" "You want to go down and take a look?" "No." "Hell, I'll tend for you. Western will go with you if you want." "You're shitting me." "I ain't shitting you." "Well, I ain't going." "I know you ain't. But if you ain't seen what we seen, maybe you ought not to be so quick about telling us what we're supposed to think about. Campbell looked at Western. Western tilted the leaves in his cup. Hell, Euler, he didn't mean anything by it. Sorry. The point is, I don't have a story about how that plane got down there. And every time I think about all the things that are wrong, the list gets longer.